welcome to the Grace Again podcast. This is the beta episode number 2, recorded on Monday, October the 10th, 2016. Hello, I'm your host, John Harris, and I'm really excited about this episode of Grace Again because in this segment, I am pleased to welcome my friend Byron Harvey, and he and I are going to have a conversation about a topic that I believe many of you have been thinking about. Many of you have been experiencing here for the better part of 8, 10, or even 12 to 15 months. And the question that Byron and I are going to discuss is this: what are the words that we would use to describe the evangelical Christian's experience in this presidential election year, this season? And not only what those words are, but to elaborate on why we believe those words are describing what we've all been experiencing, or at least those of us who are evangelical Christians. And so I want to bring in my guest, Byron Harvey, and introduce him and ask him first before we get into that question. Byron, welcome to the program first.
Thank you, John.
First of all, this is a complete curveball and shock, surprise to you. I forgot to mention this before we went into the recording, but I'm curious to know, when it comes to the measurement of engagement, like disengaged or highly engaged, how would you describe the last, 25, 30 years for you in the not just government and politics, but in presidential politics? When you go back to Ross Perot and maybe H.W. Bush and all the way through the Clinton years, the first Clinton years, Bush, Obama, and now potentially another Clinton, and you look at that whole swath of time, how would you measure your own personal seasons, ups and downs of highly engaged versus withdrawn and disengaged over that time? Is it flat or is it up and down, in and out? How would you answer that question?
Thanks, John. Generally speaking, I would use the term highly engaged to describe my level of involvement, and I'll trace this back to the fact that I wrote my first newspaper editorial that was published in the Roanoke Times when I believe I was 13 years of age.
Whoa, okay.
And so I couldn't wait to vote for Ronald Reagan in my first voting election.
Wow.
And I have been very interested. Politics is something that's interested me for a variety of reasons I don't think we want to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And I would describe myself as having been very engaged from the time of my teenage, and then a little bit more knowledgeably, I guess, from the time of maybe my college years up until May of this year.
Okay, maybe we can get into that in just a moment as to why you would say up until May of this year. But let me clarify. You're telling me that ever since your first vote for President Ronald Reagan, there's never been a dip in your engagement. You would characterize it as a constant, highly engaged for that many years.
Yeah, I would. And the reason is that a lot of my reading, if I could categorize the largest broad areas of my reading and interaction through the years, there are two things that stand out: the church, and specifically the outworking of the church, and then the interaction of Christian faith with public policy and living the Christian faith in the public arena, which, of course, presidential politics is only part of that, but a significant part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got another question that I want to ask you later in this podcast, but for now, I'd like for us to tackle the question of this program, this episode, and let me repeat it. It is, between the two of us, what words come to our mind to adequately describe what the experience and the journey has been like for a year or so now, especially for evangelical Christians. And I'm asking for us to come up with these words not only from our own experience. And so this is not a conversation that says, well, what has it been like for you and what has it been like for me? But what do we think it has been like for the larger Christian community for evangelical Christians, what have we observed and heard from our friends or maybe we just have a hunch we think it's been this way. I'll go first. I'll throw one word out there just to get us started.
Don't take my word. I've got one main word, and if you take it, you're in trouble.
Okay. I tell you what, if I doubt it's your word, I very seriously doubt it's your word.
Okay.
But if it is, you can just say, hey, that's my word. I'm jumping in here.
Or if I like it better than my word, I'll just steal it.
No, I don't think you're going to like this word better. Actually, this is a softball word. I think it's just a way to introduce the topic and get us started because my word, this first word is really, I think, on the kind of the aesthetic, practical, external side of things, not so much the internal things of what's going on, but the experience of it all. I'll start with the word overwhelmed. And what I mean by that is what's going through my mind is it could be overwhelmed in a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons, but I've got this in mind. Technology is changing so much and has been exponentially. The rate of change is changing. It's going faster and faster. And so what I believe that means is that, 4 years used to be a long time between two presidential elections, and not much change by way of medium of communication would really happen or occur. But the rate of change is so fast that you go from one previous presidential election to another one in 4 years. Well, the modes and the multitude of the ways that we receive information and content is just exploding. And so I believe that has produced and caused just a sense of being overwhelmed by all the info and all the story and the narratives coming from all different sides. That's the first word that comes to my mind is kind of information overload. And I'll go ahead and throw a second related word that I believe is a result of that first one I just said that I don't think is your word at all. I think because of that, I think there's an hyper fragmentation of it all.
You're right. That was not my word. You're right. Good.
Okay, good. I'm not stealing your word, but what I mean by fragmented, it's like not only has the information and narrative coming at us from all different ways, but it's not in larger blocks like it used to be. It's in shorter snippets and smaller blocks, and it's being delivered to the population in a multitude of formats. And so what it causes and produces is just a hodgepodge of fragmented bits of data that are hard to connect to what might be called information. And even if you can get information to connect those bits of information in such a way that it's true, it's truth and it's knowledge to even arrive at wisdom about this whole thing. And so just that fragmented kind of overwhelming sense of experience. I'll stop there because that leads to other things. But those are my first two words. What do you think of those two that I just mentioned? Do you agree or relate or resonate with them? Or?
I agree and I resonate with them. And I'm going to twist. I'm going to throw a little twist into something you said.
Okay.
You just use the term information overload, which I agree with. But I'm gonna twist it and say information overload, misinformation overload, and disinformation overload.
I mean, the difference between the second and the third one being what?
Misinformation being wrong things communicated, disinformation being deceitful things communicated.
Got it. Wow.
And I think there has been, and I'm not always sure which is which, but one of the things that has struck me in this, referring to what you said, in this election cycle, has been the amount of what I call junk websites.
Okay.
That are I characterize them in one of several ways. Blatantly biased. To the point of, secondly, uh, uh, willfully, intentionally distorting and knowledgeably
Mm.
distorting the truth.
Mhm.
And I see these things. And of course, one of the key mediums, it's one that I use a lot, as you know, it's one that you at least lurk a lot and use a little bit, is Facebook.
Right.
Because you see I post things. And the overload of information, misinformation, and disinformation
Mhm.
that is gotten and then regurgitated on Facebook from some of these junk websites
Mm.
for whom credibility is not an issue. I responded several months ago to this particular point, and I said, if you want to say that CNN and CBS, ABC, NBC, and certainly MSNBC, and on the other side, Fox,
Mhm.
have a bias, fair enough.
Mhm.
But they have to, they have a higher standard and a higher thing at stake to maintain credibility
Mhm.
to the point where there are limits beyond which they cannot go or dare not go.
Mhm.
Yeah, some of them have been pushing those, I realize. But some of these junk websites have no such concern.
Mhm.
And they'll put anything out there.
Yeah.
And because most of my friends, not all, I'm glad, but most of my friends come from a political position that is somewhat close to mine,
Right.
I tend to see the right wing junk websites, and it drives me nuts.
Hmm.
And I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed, and that's going to segue nicely into my first word.
Okay, but before you say your first word, I
Yeah.
want to revisit some of the things you've said. Is that's okay with you?
Mm, sure.
So what you're saying here is what I've heard you say is that this overwhelmingly increased number of junk websites and the miss part and the dis part aren't the same, but you admittedly just said it's hard to tell some of them apart between the misinformation and the complete deceitful disinformation.
Right.
Um, it's interesting how you brought up because you brought up CNN and ABC and basically the big networks. And I was already going there to challenge your point or to push back against what you're saying. Because if you go back 40 or 50 years ago, the reality was there was only two or three networks and they had a monopoly on the news. And so they could pretty much miss and diss and do anything they wanted to do. And so a part of the freedom of communication and freedom of press and freedom of the people has been the introduction of the internet that
Right.
gives the population the opportunity to communicate and not be only receiving news from one or two or three sources.
Right.
So
Right.
so the pendulum swings. Are you saying the pendulum swings all the way over there to this standard of freedom or this experience of freedom of communication? But it can go so far that it loses a standard of credibility of truth and facts and veracity. Is that
Yeah.
and are you saying,
John,
in addition to that, are you saying that there's something to be said about the behemoth big daddies of that have to have an accountability to one another and a standard of journalism, at least to some degree, that keeps things out of the junk drawer and at least a standard above which we can say this is reasonable. Is that kind of what you're saying?
yeah, and I think my response to that is when we think about freedom, and I'm a
Mm-hmm.
huge believer in it,
Mm-hmm.
as you know.
Yeah.
What is the safeguard? What is the balance to freedom? It is responsibility.
Right.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
And what and I suppose, boy, you could run a long way with this, uh, well beyond the constraints of the press or this election season or anything. But you know, are we? Is there a concomitant responsibility that is balancing, that is informing, that is safeguard, that is not safeguarding, but that is that's coming alongside our freedom? And I think the answer is no.
Hmm.
There is no real responsibility that's coming alongside our freedom. And so these junk websites and others are saying whatever whatever they want to, and there's little accountability for that. And but because somebody is, because it's online, it's funny. The joke is, well, it's online, so it must be true. That's not a joke anymore, John.
Yeah, right. That's like truth. That's like it's online, so it must be true. It's actually the opposite. It's almost like the opposite, right?
Yeah, almost. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
if
yeah.
it's online, it must not be true.
Well,
Yeah, you almost get to that point. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Now, when you say junk websites, lest we, you know, in our own minds and all those who are listening to this, kind of go to that place of thinking what they think to be junk and what you think to be junk, which is really illustrative of the problem, because
yeah,
I mean, yeah,
sure.
you're calling a certain website junk, and you're basically saying that you think it is,
Right.
whether you don't have any idea whether the authors of this website believe in their content or are deceitful. The point is, as you just said it, there's no standard bearer. We don't have this way to safeguard. You didn't want to use that word, but bring some
Yeah,
credibility to it. Can you give can you give one safe example to a junk? What would be, well, you don't have to name the website, but at least give an example of
yeah,
what goes on so that we have an idea of what you're talking about.
sure. There was a website, and actually, I've not seen it quoted in in 2 or 3 months, and I'm hopeful it went out of business.
Mm,
Hopeful. I really am. Because it's complete junk.
mm,
But I regularly saw friends who would reference this website, and it was, um, it was very blatantly biased. And finally, a headline came up that was nothing but an absolute lie,
mm,
an easily demonstrable lie.
mm,
And so I thought, all right, I'm going to go see who or what this is.
mm.
And it was some guy, a professing Christian, who filled his website with, uh, you know, scripture misquoted, pulled out of context, what have you,
Mm.
but who was just blatantly distorting things.
Mm.
And it just, now again, I haven't seen it for the last 2 or 3 months, and maybe it's out of business, or maybe the fella who would post it regularly. I know there's one particular guy, was a friend of mine on Facebook, who would post from it regularly,
Mm.
and I cannot read that stuff and keep silent.
Mhm.
So I said, and I gave his name in my response, and I said, "This is a lie. You know it's a lie, and the guy that wrote it knows it's a lie."
Mm.
Maybe I didn't say you know it's a lie.
Yeah.
I was pretty strong,
Yeah.
that this is simply a lie,
Yeah.
and it is,
Gotcha.
and I know the guy that wrote it knows he's lying,
Oh.
but
Mm.
all in the name of supporting this particular candidate,
Mm.
anything goes. And what happens on these junk websites I'm talking about is they provide fodder for those who do what I call drinking the Kool-Aid,
Mhm.
you know?
Yep. Would
And
you
boy, there's been a lot of Kool-Aid drinking. I know we're going down the path here,
Yeah.
but a lot of excusing the inexcusable because heaven forbid the other candidate gets elected.
Yeah.
And so some of these junk websites provide the fodder to assassinate the other candidate and put the best possible and sometimes the best impossible spin
Yeah.
on the candidate that they're supporting. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking about. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. That's good. And while you're answering it, I can't help but to think that when you say junk websites in comparison to, your CNN credible, which you're saying might have a bias, but at least there's a higher standard of credibility there.
Right.
It doesn't seem like, if you take all the websites that are out there, that all of them are in one or the other. It seems like there's this iterated, graduated
Oh,
degree
sure.
all in between,
Sure.
which it compounds and kind of comes back to illustrating my first word or two, and that is, we're overwhelmed not only with information and misinformation and disinformation, but we're overwhelmed with opinions and perspectives, and to put it all together and to try to make sense of it all. It's not just homogeneous. It's like there's degrees of going both from the middle to the left and middle to the right, and everywhere in between. And the further you get out to the extreme on either side, the more junk you have, like you're saying. So anyway, maybe we just wrap up this part of the conversation. Any other concluding thoughts with this whole sort of technology and what it's caused? And I think, let me ask it in this way: would you agree that it's by degree worse or different than it was just 4 years ago?
It sure seems that way to me. It sure seems that way to me, and I think the overwhelmed nature of it that you speak of was, I don't know if this is the perfect storm, but I think it also was, I don't want to use the word helped because overwhelmed is a bad word, but it was fostered by the fact that, typically there are 3 to 5 candidates from each party at most. And the Republicans had 17 at the beginning. And there was no way that we could even begin to legitimately get a grasp on all 17 of these people. Not possible. And I think that, I guess in a benign way, I mean, what are you going to say? No, you can't run for president, but in some way, I think that played into it as well. We were overwhelmed by the sheer number. There were 5, I think, on the Democrat, 4 or 5 on the Democratic side, 5, I believe, and 17 on the Republican side. So we're overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, unlike we've ever seen before.
Right. Yeah.
And that played into it.
Yeah. So all these things contribute to my first word or two of just feeling what are the words that are describing the experience. I think we've been overwhelmed, and therefore a negative way to say it is not real focused. We've been splintered and fragmented, and you've added sort of this idea of information overload, misinformation. Do I believe that this is accurate and true, or disinformation? Can I trust the person that's even putting this out?
And there's one more thing that occurs to me as well, and that is, in this kind of climate, little things become big things, and big things can often become little things. The sense of perspective in this overwhelmed climate, I think that is also an effect of this overwhelming you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think that was somewhat what I was getting at. I think it's not unrelated earlier when I was talking about the difference between just raw data and facts, and putting those facts together for information, and those information builds together to have knowledge. And knowledge, ultimately, through experience and practicing that knowledge, you gain wisdom, which is by definition perspective. And all of this is eroding and getting in the way of going down that path. It comes back to one little small bit and bite of data after the next, which, like you just said, all those little things become big things. And the very big thing of wisdom and perspective becomes either small or lost altogether.